So the intention of this session is really to talk a little bit about what is entailed in actually researching health policy. And I was hoping that I can bring some case studies, examples of research that has been done, just touching on some of the research that our group has done because we are interested in this area. And I also recognize that the world of governance research is something that may be relevant in the setting. There's a strong overlap between policy analysis, implementation analysis, governance research. So let me just quickly start a little bit by defining what the sort of ontology of decisions, what it means when decisions, what is the nature of decisions getting made, how do decisions get made, and then so that frames what we are researching. Once we know that, then we can think about how to research it. That's basically what we do as policy analysts. These are the actors. There can be different types of actors. We don't only research policy makers. We can research anybody because we believe that everybody has a role in making decisions that are relevant for policy change and action. It's not an exhaustive list. The idea is not to give a full list, but let's just think about how these people operate. So if you're in the system, then you have a particular place. You are subject to an environment which can include a particular set of policies which has a significance for you. But most people are not machines, like we've discussed. They don't just take the policies and spit out the outputs. That's a big fallacy. What they do rather is they operate in a particular policy environment. They make a number of decisions in that context about what to do, which is conditioned by that policy environment, and that their decisions have significance, very major significance for performance and outcomes of the system. Maybe this is a bit more useful way to look at it. So what is actually happening here? Let's open the black box and think about the anatomy of this decision. How is this decision being made and what is the decision? So they're getting some inputs, some cognitive inputs, and something is happening in their brains. This one is crucial. On the basis of those cognitive inputs and on the basis of their internal, their character, their personality, their individuality, they arrive at judgments. They make appreciations of a particular situation. They make an assessment of a situation. And they base their behavior on that judgment. So there's no one theory determining this. As we've already discussed, there are multiple theories, right from the ideas-based theories to the interest-based theories. So rational choice would suggest that they are making these decisions, they are making these judgments and behaving in a particular way based on maximizing their interest. Discourse theory will say that they are conditioned by the environment in a way to make judgment. But this bit is crucial. How are they making those judgments? We need to understand how they are working. An important part of behavior, especially in systems, we are talking about people-centered health systems, one of the core principles, it's all about relationships. Systems are a compound of relationships. So an important part of the behavior is how they interact with others. And this interaction conditions the cognition, contributes to the cognition of the other person. So now we've got a bigger picture. So all of this contributes to their behavior and their interactions which contribute to system performance and outcomes. So this is the kind of reality of what we are trying to understand. And it's not easy to understand this because a lot of it, this is sometimes obvious, but this is not. This is what we need to get at. We need to try and find out. And among all of this, we also need to try and understand this. Are they capable of changing the way they receive inputs, make judgments and behave? Because if we want to change systems, then we have to change the people in the systems, or we have to give them the conditions in which they can change. Okay, so we already went through this. Rational choice approach predicts the behavior of individuals based on economic theories of maximization of self-interest. So the rational choice approach suggests a particular way in which people make judgments and they act. There is a alternative theory called bounded rationality, which suggests that people make these kinds of rational decisions based on their maximization of self-interest, but they are also driven by a number of affective considerations. So affect is their feelings, passion, instincts. So there's a balance between intellectual decision making, rational decision making of self-interest, and of affective decision making. And rationality here is seen as the ideal and actual behavior as a divergence from the ideal. And the suggestion in bounded rationality is that organizations should function by maximizing rationality, so becoming more intelligent, being able to design their activities and conditioning choices. So we won't go into some of the debates here, it's a bit too much. And then the discourse theory suggests that actors operate in particular ways in which there are collective ways in which they understand the world. So most doctors are likely to see the world, in a similar way, likely to see problems in a similar way, because they constitute a sort of a community which is called a community of meaning. They have the same way of understanding problems, or understanding health problems, and users may not have the same way of understanding. So trying to understand the difference between how people understand problems and to understand how communities of meaning operate in different ways is a very useful way of explaining why systems don't work. Yeah? I'm just simplifying it. Don't go into all of the detail. So what discourse theory it gives is examples of how systems don't work. Sometimes a system of meaning doesn't correspond. There are discordances in systems of meaning. The way the regulator looks at the problem is not the same way the way the doctor looks at it, the way the manager looks at it is not the same way. So it's basically gaps in understanding. This is a good framework to understand the core point that I mentioned, judgment. How do people make decisions? So there's a very simple, elegant framework, the policy learning cycle, from 1965, written up by a British civil servant. So what this individual said is that people who are involved in policy decision making make two types of judgments. They make a type of judgment about a value judgment, about what should be happening, and they make a judgment of reality, which is a pragmatic side. So people have a pragmatic side and they have a value driven side. And they combine these two judgments and form an overall appreciation of a situation. And that's what conditions their actions. So they decide, on the basis of this appreciation, they decide what to do and how to do it. Yeah? Okay, it sounds abstract. Let's apply it in a real world situation. This is an actual study published from my PhD work. Why health regulators in India don't actually regulate? So we interviewed a number of people. This is not just from one study actually, this is from a number of studies in which we investigated the actions of regulators. It's also drawing from work that we did, Prasanna, on regulatory architecture. So we try and understand what are the judgments that are being made by people working as regulators. They make a certain set of judgments which are based on reality. They have complicated relationships with the people they are expected to regulate. It's a politically complex relationship. They don't get support from senior authorities. They're not really supported in doing their job. People don't really support them in, regulation requires a lot of autonomy and a lot of power actually, because it's a bad cop job, it's not a popular job. So you need to be supported to do that, and you need to be protected when you do that, and very often the regulators don't get that. And of course they also lack capacity, there are not enough of them to do their job. So these are the reality judgments that they make, which are, I think most of us would agree, are actually fairly objectively true. But this is based on interviews, so these are the reality judgments they make. Then they also make a series of value judgments. First, this one, interesting one. So the regulators are also often healthcare providers. So they empathize with the people they are regulating. They empathize with their rights rather than with the rights of users. Yeah, it's natural. You went to college with those people. You grew up with those people. You empathize with them. Okay, then this is an interesting one. Most regulators saw the roles of their organizations not as being regulatory but as being entrepreneurial, of developing. We want to develop new things, we want to make new things. Even though they are in regulatory bodies, their mandate is not to create new institutions or to create programs or schemes, but they got involved in that. So they favored those kinds of activities rather than the regulatory activities. That's a value judgment they made. And they got almost completely disengaged from regulatory principles. They didn't even agree with some of the things they're expected to do. We don't agree that these rules should be implemented, this establishment act should be put into place. We don't agree with it. So, and on the basis of that, they constituted a meaning, and they acted on these lines. They tended to focus on the entrepreneurial aspects and neglect the regulatory aspects. So this gives us a clear example of how individuals working in a particular setting are put in an environment, they make a set of decisions based on their judgment, and they act in a way that unfortunately in this case does not help the system. I mean, I'm making a very broad sweep kind of statement, but they may do a particular set of actions which is not constructive. So it gives us a hint into what we need to do to change the situation. This is how policy analysis can be relevant. Okay, so this is a nice framework. So it really suggests that there is often a conflict between organization and program rationales. We discussed the other day, the vertical tells you that you need to follow policy, the organization tells you that the organization needs to function well, and frequently those rationales conflict with each other. And frequently people in the health system are put in those situations where this is a conflict. I just put that up to illustrate. Person working for the organization is constantly thinking I must perform, whereas the person working for the program is thinking I have to conform. And these are two different logics that often operate. So just another example, not a real world one, but it can be useful in trying to think. So implementation analysis. So I'm going to just talk a little bit through implementation analysis as a subset of policy analysis, a little bit different from implementation research. There is an overlap with the fields, but implementation analysis I'm talking about in the context of policy analysis. So the idea of implementation analysis is to provide multi-layered explanations and solutions for problems of implementation. And problems of implementation are often a preeminent concern. Health policy in low and middle income countries. That's often cited that there are policies but they don't get implemented. It helps in systematically investigating the functioning of complex and poorly understood systems and institutions. These are the uses, potential uses. It can be diagnostic in explaining why a policy is ineffective or partially effective. It can be strategic in identifying factors which influence the viability and effectiveness of a policy or a process. It can be prospective in generating knowledge to inform the future trajectory of those policy processes. Okay, so this is a classical view of implementation, and we are going to challenge this classical view. Classical view is that policy exists, it gets executed, and it gets implemented on the front lines. And there are a number of external factors that can influence this process. In this classical view, implementation is seen broadly as a managerial function, which happens after policy making, and it's separate from policy making. And implementation is not integral to understanding policy. A series of mundane decisions and interactions. And this is an alternative view which suggests that we can look at implementation slightly differently. In this approach, the action-centered approach, implementation is central to our understanding of policy. This approach seeks to understand what actually happens, how and why. Very simple. We just want to know what's actually happening. We don't want to know why things are not happening. We want to know what is happening. There's a shift there. Our overarching goal may be to inform our understanding of why things are not happening. Yes. But the way we go about it is by trying to find out what's actually happening. How and why. This is another important part of this implementation analysis paradigm. Written and living constitutions. So the idea here is to confront the manifestations of the living constitution with the prescriptions of the written. So again, this comes back to what we were talking about, maybe the street level bureaucracy question. Written constitutions are policy problems as defined and addressed by the system. So formal policies, the policies get written up. They are the official views of the organization of the system. But on the other hand, living constitutions are policy problems as defined and addressed by people. And there's very often a difference between how people are seeing problems and how the system is seeing the problem. And the core aspect of action-centered implementation approaches is to find out first what actually happens or gets done, to figure out how people are interpreting problems and how that is different from how the system is interpreting them. This difference between people's perceptions and the system's perceptions is crucial to understanding implementation gaps, why implementation doesn't happen. And these are the ways, these are kind of methods we can use. We either talk to people or we read stuff. Okay, case study. Implementing public health guidelines in India. The problem here was that national public health policy guidelines often don't get implemented by medical providers. So this is how I narrowed down the scope. Sorry? No, this was both public and private actually. But I narrowed down the scope by talking about medical providers, meaning doctors primarily, although it also applies to others. But then it becomes a case study to understand more broadly. The objective was to understand this problem. So it was a diagnostic objective. Why do policy practice gaps exist? These are the methods applied: in-depth interviews, framework analysis. This is the orienting framework. These are the formal implementation channels. You have policymakers, you have frontline implementers, and then you have a number of people in the middle managers, hospital managers, department heads. This work was only done in hospitals, by the way, that's another limitation. But then you can also have other groups which are impinging on the situation, so they are not part of the formal implementation channel, but they come in some way. So this was a conceptual framework, very simple, nothing, no rocket science, just a way of organizing the reality, hypothetically. The direction of the research means that I focused bottom up, so I focused mainly on the perspectives of the frontline implementers as a starting point. Okay, and these are the findings. I mean, these are blanket statements, but they were largely accurate. And people freely told me this. There was no hesitation. Obviously, I followed a fairly sophisticated process of doing interviews, and I had an advantage being a doctor. I was able to break the ice and get to talk to people when they talk to me very freely. But this is what we found. This is the primary diagnosis. Then the more interesting stuff comes up. The hardware issues, human resource capacity, not enough people to regulate, not enough staff, not enough shortage of protective equipment, so they can't implement policies because they don't have the hardware to protect them, and various problems in accessing finances at different levels. These hardware issues came up as operational issues came up quite a lot. And then I delved a bit deeper. Inter-organizational relationships, the conflicts between general health services. So this was a case study of HIV testing. I was trying to understand why people don't follow HIV testing guidelines. So again, it's a bit of a complicated slide, but let me just draw your attention to this here. The general health services operated with primarily a performance logic, whereas the HIV/AIDS program operated with a conformance logic. And there was poor coordination between these two setups. And all of this played out at the level of the government hospital. Yeah? So this was an explanation for what are the kind of conflicts that the frontline providers faced. Problematic inter-organizational relationships.
What is conformance?
Conformance means to conform, means to follow, to adhere. I need to adhere to guidelines. So the program operates almost on that kind of adherence logic, whereas the facilities operate on a performance logic. The hospital operated on a performance logic rather than on a conformance logic. What we found is that they were more interested in implementing the guidelines rather than in ensuring performance. These people were more obsessed with making sure the hospital performed well, which means they had a turnover of patients, they got people, cured and treated, and they would leave the hospital. So there were a whole sort of set of logics associated with performance, which were different from those associated with conformance. Let me give you a very simple example. The very act of taking consent and counseling in HIV testing, it's a very time consuming process. You need additional resources for that. It's also a process that the hospital was not used to. So that was an example of a conformance logic, that they felt they had to do it, that's why they did it, because they were being told to do that. So they were conforming, they were adhering, but it was not really favoring. A lot of people were against it because they did not really help the hospital to operate in an efficient way. So that was the conformance logic. That's where a classic conflict. So I think what we get out of this is that we need to find some way of reconciling performance and conformance. It's a complicated change that would have to be made. You would need to think about ways of convincing people that conformance is necessary for performance. But at the end of the day, if they don't think it is, then you have to take that into account as well, and you have to change your policies. If people don't think that the counseling process is helping them become better service providers, then there is something wrong with the counseling process, or there is something wrong with those people, and you have to do something about it. So these are the kinds of insights that you can gain. A lot of them are commonsensical insights, but you can actually do research and put them together in a formal way, and then you can act on it. This is also an important part of this. Yeah. So the administrators were answerable to SACS for the HIV-related tasks, and they were answerable to State Health Department for a range of other tasks. And so hence they were deeply conflicted individuals. On the other hand, there were also program staff located in the hospitals who were paid for by and answerable to the SACS. And this is classic. I think we see this pattern replicating when we look at the NRHM, for example, when you have NHM staff versus health system staff. We see this pattern and we see it replicating in another setting. What is that? What have we just done? Analytic generalizability. We've taken a theme and we've seen its relevance in a different setting. Yeah? It's not the same setting, but there are similarities and parallels here. This is also an interesting one, some shared posts. So some members of the SACS were also members of the State Health Department. So that ensured some sort of coordination, but not enough. And then there was very little, there was actually an active conflict between program staff and hospital staff. Okay, so see, what I'm getting from this is also a validation of our first point. This type of analysis will not give us a blueprint for what to do. Different people have different reactions to it. Somebody says, okay, these people should be changing behavior. Some people say these people should be changing behavior. But it's giving us a way of systematically understanding the problem. Then we can sit down and decide, or the person in the context who is acting in context can decide what is the best way to act based on these findings. So again, it's not blueprints, but it's giving you some insight. It's giving you an overall insight into the situation. Okay, so I also spoke to people in state medical councils. So here I found a very interesting distinction between the written constitution and the living constitution. So written constitution is the policies as the norms as established by the system. Living constitution is the norms as established by the actors, the people. Yeah? Written constitution says they should be enforcing the code of ethics and regulating practitioners' professional conduct, including adherence to prescribed practice norms. The living constitution, the role perceptions were focused on protecting the sanctity of the medical profession. So they were concerned with things like there are a lot of quacks, and we should be preventing quacks from practicing. I mean, I have no doubt that it's a good thing, but whether it was their mandate to do that or not, that was not written down. They also actively rejected the disciplinary functions. They said that we don't agree with these, we don't believe in these. And they actually, in some instances, facilitated legal protection for doctors in negligence cases. So they were acting in a way as to, I don't know how you would call it, they actually acted actually contrary to their mandate. So again, this also gives you then a diagnosis of why these institutions are failing, because the people who occupy them have subverted the institutional function. This is the diagnosis, that this is what they believe, so this is why they act the way they do. Beyond that, why they act like that, that would require a sort of an ethnographic analysis. So that level we probably don't usually, so that's what distinguishes maybe policy analysis from in-depth ethnography. And I personally have some doubts whether medical council officials would be willing to subject themselves to ethnographic analysis. But I'm sure it's a worthwhile pursuit. Okay, so just you can't read this, but I'm just saying that this is from the website of the Delhi Medical Council. So this is a public document, so I have no hesitation in showing it here. They added 2 functions. See, these first 5 functions are in there in the MCI Act. But these 2 functions are actually not present in the MCI Act, but they've added them to their website. So they've actually modified their written constitution because it got influenced by the living constitution, to provide protection to its members in discharging professional duties and to ensure that no unqualified person practices the modern system of medicine. Okay. So this is just an overall chart of how I did the study, who all I interviewed, and so it just gives you a sense of how you can also, policy analysis can also have this kind of broad mapping and overarching function, but no need to go into that in depth.